We ended our last presentation with the consideration of a point made by Thomas Sullivan, that the key distinction on which the traditional idea that active euthanasia is wrong is based is not the mere distinction between killing and letting die. Rather, according to Sullivan, the key distinction has to do with intention. We may not act in a way that intends death, that's why killing is wrong, but we may act in a way that foresees death, so long as death is not our intention. Let's consider that distinction further. Let me invite you to recall our earlier discussion related to the principle of beneficence, of the distinction between consequentialism and deontology. You may remember that consequentialism is the idea that the only thing that makes an action right or wrong is its consequences. Now, from that perspective, intended consequences versus unintended consequences make no difference. It's simply the consequences of our action. If they're good, the action is right. If they're wrong or bad, the action is wrong. Now, as we saw there when we discussed consequentialism, one of the critiques is, can we always foresee or predict the consequences of our actions? That's one problem. But now I think Sullivan is suggesting another one, and that is to say, isn't there a moral difference between the consequences we intend and those that we merely foresee but do not intend, those side effects? Remember also, beneficence surely requires us to act in ways that promote people's welfare. It requires us to do actions that are inherently beneficial. But I've also suggested that beneficence does mean that we should attend to the overall consequences of our actions. Now, let me offer a proposal that expands on those ideas based upon this distinction between intended and foreseen but not intended consequences that Sullivan draws. Here's my proposal. We have some responsibility for all the consequences of our actions. The consequentialist is onto something when he or she points to the moral relevance of consequences. But we have some, so we do have, I agree, we have some responsibility for all the consequences of our action. But we have more responsibility for those consequences we can foresee or predict than we are those that we could not have foreseen or predicted. Beyond that, we are even more responsible for those consequences we can foresee as highly probable. And we are most responsible, and here's where I'm agreeing with Sullivan, we are most responsible for those consequences that we intend through our actions. Indeed, might we not say, thinking back to that distinction between consequentialism and deontology, which focuses on the inherent features of actions, that a consequence of our action that is intended and highly probable may well best be described as an inherent feature of the action. What I'm suggesting here is consistent with what has been called in moral philosophy the principle of double effect. That principle raises the following question. Is an action that has two sets of consequences, one good and one bad, morally permissible? Now, what are some examples? Well, we've already seen some. Like you drive downtown, and as a result, you can see a movie, which is good, but you also wear out your tires. That's bad. May you do that. Let's consider an act of war. You bomb a factory that's producing weapons for an unjust enemy's army. The good effect is that you weaken their military capability. But if you kill some innocent civilians who live near the factory, that's bad. Let's think about withdrawing a life-sustaining treatment. As a result, a patient's unnecessary suffering is shortened. That's good. But they die more quickly. That's bad. Or think about this, which is a complicating factor in this discussion of active versus passive euthanasia. Suppose you give a patient a high dose of morphine because their suffering is so unrelenting. As a result of that high dose of morphine, the patient's pain is alleviated. That's good. But they also die more quickly as a result of that extra dose of morphine or that high dose. Are these actions permissible? Well, the principle of double effect says to think about it this way. They say, first, the act is permissible only if the good effect or consequence is intended. If you are intending the bad effect, you should not do it. Let's say if you are intending to kill the innocent civilians around the factory, then you can't engage in this bombing campaign. If you are seeking and intending the patient's death when you withdraw that life-sustaining treatment, then that's wrong. If you give the dose of morphine intending to kill the patient, that is wrong. Second thing the principle of double effect says is that the evil effect, the bad effect, may not be a means to the good one. Let's think about that last dose of morphine. We've said that the good effect is that it reduces the patient's suffering. The question that principle of double effect would require you to ask is this: did you reduce their suffering only by killing them, or did the morphine reduce their suffering apart from the fact that it also contributed to their death? Again, if the morphine relieves their suffering directly and not by means of the evil effect, the principle of double effect would say it's permissible. Well, finally, and this one requires less comment, the principle of double effect says the good effect must outweigh the evil one. Again, let's think of withdrawing a life-sustaining treatment. Patient is suffering in an unalleviable way, and they're not going to live very long anyway. Well, when you remove that life-sustaining treatment, you shorten their suffering, and that's good. But you also shorten their lives, but that's bad. But in fact, their life is of very low quality. In fact, they're not going to live very long anyway. The idea would be that bad effect is very minimal. So you could, in fact, in that situation, withdraw the life-sustaining treatment according to the principle of double effect. Key issue here, relevant to our entire discussion, is this principle of double effect acknowledges the difference between types of consequences and puts an emphasis on our moral responsibility to avoid intentionally causing bad consequences like death. James Rachels wrote an essay in response to Thomas Sullivan. It's not one of your assigned readings, but I do think it important and interesting to point out his argument in response to Sullivan and Sullivan's emphasis on intentions. Rachels argues that motive, the reason behind one's intentions, is more important than intentions themselves. I mean, you might think about this. We broadly accept intentional killing in self-defense, in a just war, or for many of us as punishment. And we accept that. And a part of the idea would be, supportive of the direction that Rachels goes with his argument, is the motive in those cases. The motives are good ones. They aren't hateful. We kill in self-defense to preserve our lives. We kill in just wars in order in order to pursue justice. Excuse me. And same with capital punishment. Now, Rachels, in applying this to the debate about active and passive euthanasia, argues that whether we kill or let die, and I think he has in mind letting die in situations where we know that our withdrawal of the treatment is very likely to result in a more hasty death. In both of those cases, we are intending death. We are intending killing. The moral difference has not to do with those intentions. The moral difference, or the moral thing we need to examine, rather than our intentions, is our motives. Why are we seeking death? Think back to Smith and Jones. Smith and Jones, one killed, one let die, are both wrong. They're both evil because their motive was selfish. Their motive was greed. But when a physician lets a patient die, his motive is compassion. But similarly, when a doctor kills, Rachel says, in the kind of situation we're talking about, their motive is a compassionate one. And therefore, we should find that morally acceptable, permissible. There is one other aspect of the debate that I should return to very quickly. I did allude earlier to Callahan's argument that even if active euthanasia might seem permissible in general, it's not appropriate to the role of the physician. We have physicians and other healthcare professionals to cure and to care, but not to kill. Folks like Sullivan and Brock have a response to that, and Brock particularly addresses that issue. He puts it in the language of the moral center of medicine. He argues that the moral center of medicine is defined with reference to patient self-determination and patient welfare. And precisely because he's made his argument for voluntary active euthanasia with reference to those two key norms and values, then it's wrong to see allowing physicians to put their patients to death in certain situations at the patient's request. It's wrong to see that as somehow threatening what healthcare is about. What healthcare is about, Brock wants to say, is promoting patient welfare in the ways that patients desire and seek. And when a patient asks us to put them to death because they are dying soon anyway and they are experiencing unrelenting suffering, then we're simply doing, as healthcare professionals, what we've always been doing, promoting patient welfare in the ways that they self-determine are appropriate. So all of this seems to me to raise these four important issues. Is it, in fact, always wrong to intend the death of an innocent person? Should our respect for patient autonomy and welfare override our concerns about the wrongness of intentional killing? And to whom does a person's life belong? Are we right to give patients full self-determination over the manner and means of their dying? And should we as a society, on the basis of all this, amend the covenant we have with healthcare professionals? Amend it so that we, in fact, allow them to kill in certain situations at a patient's request. We have them to cure us, we have them to care for us, and we have them to express that caring by killing us in some situations. Do we want to make that shift? Let me conclude this presentation by returning to a case we've talked about several times, my friend Fred. You remember Fred. His best friend is his physician. Fred is dying of cancer, and though he has tried hospice care and the best palliative care available, he is still suffering incredibly. And so he asks repeatedly for his friend, his physician friend, to kill him. His physician friend says, I can't do that. That's illegal. It's inappropriate to my role as a physician. But Fred appeals to their friendship. What are the issues in this case? How would we analyze the physician's obligations? I would argue that clearly non-maleficence points to the wrongness of killing Fred. Non-maleficence would suggest that he should not kill Fred. So, as we currently define it, does fidelity as a physician. Generally, we don't acknowledge that killing is a part of the physician's duties and responsibilities. Finally, in most places it's illegal, and we would argue that the state has a legitimate expectation of this physician that he obey the law and not kill his friend Fred. Now, what might we appeal to justify killing Fred despite all this? Well, first, autonomy. The physician is obligated to respect his friend's autonomy, and that may mean that he may not coerce him, he may not manipulate him, but in this case, he must also cooperate with his voluntary, autonomous choice. One might argue that in Fred's situation, where he's not going to live much longer anyway, and where his suffering is unrelenting, that to kill him, it promotes his welfare, promotes his best interest, as beneficence requires. And finally, one might argue that the covenant they have made as friends overrides his covenant as a physician, overrides even his obligations to the government or to the state to obey its laws, and because of their friendship, he should kill Fred. That, it seems to me, is the dilemma that he faces. This concludes our discussion of the moral issues related to active euthanasia, related to the question of whether physicians or other healthcare professionals should ever put their patients to death. Next time, we'll look at this issue as a matter of social policy. What ought the law be? What should professional codes say? Should we change the covenant we have with the healthcare professional?